For Nazi Germany, the very first days and months of World War II began not with heavy and exhausting battles, but with solemn and victorious marches accompanied by loud music and the joyful shouts of crowds. Judging by surviving personal diaries and letters from German officers of that time, it resembled a light and pleasant stroll through European capitals more than a true bloody conflict. They were full of arrogance and absolute confidence in their own superiority over everyone. To the adversaries, the Polish campaign ended with lightning speed, and in the eyes of the invaders, the Poles appeared to be mediocre fighters, unable to hold back the onslaught of the Wehrmacht's iron machine. France also capitulated too quickly and swiftly, which only strengthened the Nazis' belief in their invincibility and exceptionalism, creating a dangerous illusion of permissiveness and impunity for years to come. It was precisely because of these rapid and stunning successes that the living conditions for Hitler's soldiers during that period were simply excellent, and even luxurious by wartime standards. The chief war criminal himself, the ideologue of Nazism Adolf Hitler, repeatedly and loudly declared from the highest tribunes that the valiant German army must be fully provided with absolutely everything best and necessary for a comfortable existence. The Führer demanded that his soldiers receive the most modern and deadly weaponry, perfectly tailored uniforms made of high-quality fabric, and delicious food. They were even to have the opportunity to satisfy their natural male needs and gain access to women, affection, and attention, which was considered a crucial element in maintaining high morale and combat readiness. That is why the authorities of the Third Reich developed and implemented a centralized system of so-called pleasure houses. These were created not spontaneously, but systematically and in an organized manner as part of the huge state machine designed to provide the army with everything necessary for life and service. Initially, all active military operations were conducted exclusively within the territory of civilized Europe and within a relatively small geographical space. Therefore, all organized pleasure houses were stationary, housed in solid stone buildings with heating, running water, and other benefits of civilization. Inside these establishments, everything was organized with that famous and notorious German pedantry and neatness, where every trifle and detail was written out in instructions and strictly controlled by special services and responsible persons to ensure that order was observed rigorously and constantly. At that time, staff for such elite establishments were recruited exclusively from among pure-blooded German women who went into this service voluntarily. They sincerely considered it their patriotic duty and sacred obligation to serve the tired soldiers of the great German army, thereby making their feasible contribution to the common cause of the nation's victory. These ladies regularly and mandatorily visited qualified doctors, underwent thorough medical examinations, performed all necessary hygiene procedures, and monitored the cleanliness of their bodies, underwear, and clothes. An atmosphere of external nobility, decency, and order reigned in the establishments, and everything looked decorous and respectable. But such an idyllic and beautiful picture was observed only at the very beginning of World War II and lasted exactly until the invasion of the vast expanses of the Soviet Union began and the Great Patriotic War flared up, which radically changed everything and turned the former ease into a real nightmare and horror. The situation changed in everything, becoming harsh, cruel, and terrible in all respects and spheres of life. But before speaking about the decline, it is worth describing in detail how the norms of this specific labor were arranged and how this huge entertainment industry for the military worked. Everything was conceived and planned by the Reich leadership as follows. The entire system was thought out to the smallest detail, and all establishments were strictly and clearly divided into categories and classes depending on military rank and social status of the visitors, in order to observe army hierarchy and subordination. There were separate luxurious establishments designed specifically for senior officers and generals, where the level of service and comfort was maximal. There were simpler houses for lower-ranking officers, and completely simple and primitive places for private soldiers, infantry, tankers, and artillerymen. Separate special establishments were organized for sailors of the Navy because these men went to sea for a long time, did not see shore or women for months, were in the confined space of ships and submarines, and needed a special approach and conditions for rest after returning to their home port. Military pilots of the Luftwaffe enjoyed special privileges and rights in this system. They were rightfully considered the true elite of the armed forces and heroes of the skies, and therefore, aviation fighters were always equated with officers and had free access to the best establishments, even if they formally did not have an officer rank and wore simple shoulder straps. This was considered quite fair and deserved, by and large, as pilots risked their lives in the sky and performed the most difficult combat missions. The command tried in every way to encourage them and distinguish them from the general mass of servicemen with special treatment and privileges. The working day in these houses usually began around 2 in the afternoon and lasted until 8 or 9 in the evening. This time was strictly regulated and scheduled by the minute, but this did not mean at all that the girls idled and rested in bed for the first half of the day. They had enough cares and chores from the very early morning. For example, it was mandatory to visit the doctor and undergo an unpleasant examination, then iron clothes, bring the bed linen into perfect order, prepare their rooms for the reception of numerous guests, and make themselves beautiful and polished. By the way, the topic of medical control deserves special and close attention. While it is certainly good that they were constantly examined and checked, such high and inhumane workload norms were established per day that it was difficult to realistically keep track of health and guarantee complete safety. Speaking of which, the girls who worked in establishments for the enlisted personnel served ordinary soldiers daily and interacted very closely with a dozen different Wehrmacht fighters. This number could be slightly less or slightly more depending on the situation, but on average, the load remained colossal and frightening. It is scary even to think and imagine the full horror and tragedy of the situation where a lady had 10 different men in a single day. And this continued regularly and daily, without weekends, holidays, or breaks for rest and recovery. What can one even talk about in such conditions, and what can one hope for? If a woman contracted a disease today, it might not be detected or noticed by tomorrow morning. Yet she would go to work and continue to serve soldiers, passing the infection further down the chain, even though doctors tried to monitor this with all their might. The workload norm for officers was significantly lower, amounting to approximately 50 or 60 people per house per day. This does not necessarily mean that there was such a full load every day, but it allowed for maintaining a calmer and more measured rhythm of work and ensuring better control and quality of services. Visits to pleasure houses by officers were essentially uncontrolled by anyone. They could come there completely freely at any convenient time during the establishment's operating hours and enjoy the society of ladies without any restrictions or unnecessary bureaucratic formalities. Soldiers, however, were issued special paper coupons, a few per month. Without this document, entry to the ladies was categorically forbidden and closed, and strict guards at the entrance carefully monitored compliance with this rule and let no outsiders in. There were not infrequent cases when simple Hitlerite soldiers tried to ignore the absence of coupons and broke inside by force, cunning, or bribery, but this never led to anything good for them and ended very lamentably and sadly. Violators of discipline were punished cruelly and demonstratively, sent to the guardhouse and the brig, deprived of leave and other benefits of army life, and branded with shame before comrades and commanders. It also happened that enlisted fighters tried to secretly enter a pleasure house intended exclusively for officers and higher personnel. This was also punished with maximum severity and ruthlessness as a daring encroachment on the privileges and status of the command. It is quite understandable and explainable why ordinary soldiers had such a strong desire to get into an establishment not of their status. After all, the ladies provided to officers were better and more beautiful, and the conditions there were much more pleasant, cleaner, and neater, smelling of perfume and freshness rather than sweat and tobacco. In the soldiers' establishments, the situation was frankly not very good and even depressing. One Hitlerite fighter recalled with disgust in his memoirs that the stench there was so strong and unbearable that one ought to be offered a clothespin for the nose at the entrance just to breathe somehow. And this is quite understandable and logical, for if a poor girl served 100 fighters a day sick, likely implies aggregate overtime or a typo in source. Earlier text said 10/day. She simply physically had no time to wash and tidy herself up between clients, change linen, or ventilate the room. Soldiers also came there not from the shower or the hairdresser, and not in dress uniform, but straight from training grounds or dirty trenches, bringing with them dust, sweat, and the smells of war and barracks, all mixing into heavy and stale air. Everything changed radically for the worse when the real, large-scale Second World War began and massive combat operations unfolded over huge territories. This entire well-oiled system began to falter and burst at the seams. Firstly, the majority of pleasure houses simply could no longer remain stationary and cozy buildings deep in the rear. Yes, of course, officers and soldiers somewhere in Germany or France could still visit such places and enjoy comfort. But the front line from 1941 to 1945 moved quite quickly and unpredictably in different directions, now to the east, now to the west, changing its outlines every day and week. Therefore, mobile homes on wheels, specially converted trucks, and railway carriages that followed on the heels of the army came into vogue and became the most in demand. This definitively killed the remnants of former comfort and turned the process into a mechanical affair. Furthermore, many German women flatly refused to go far east into cold, incomprehensible, and dangerous Russia, agreeing to serve the soldiers of their country only within Germany or, at most, in calm Europe with its mild climate. They absolutely did not want to leave for the East and risk their lives and health. Therefore, the command had to dodge in every way, look for new non-standard solutions to the personnel issue, and compromise their conscience and ideology. At first, girls were hired from among those peoples whom the Nazis considered related or close to the Aryan race, trying to somehow preserve the appearance of racial purity and order in the ranks of the service personnel. Later, they had to recruit women from occupied territories and use the local population for the needs of the Wehrmacht. However, there was one strictest and categorical prohibition concerning Jewish women. Their involvement was absolutely inadmissible. German soldiers and officers were categorically forbidden, under pain of death or tribunal, to enter into any intimate relations and connections with them, and this rule was observed rigorously and strictly controlled by security services. Gradually, this whole story with organized pleasure houses came to naught and lost its relevance and meaning, because Hitler's soldiers, under constant fire and bombing, had no time for pleasures, entertainment, and joys. After the turning point of 1943, the situation became completely deplorable and particularly heavy, as the army thought only of survival, retreat, and saving their own lives, not of women, affection, or comfort. By the way, the war criminal Adolf Hitler himself often stated in his numerous speeches, if paraphrasing the context, that girls would provide services to the heroes of the front completely free of charge and at the expense of a generous and grateful state. In reality, however, in addition to the mandatory presentation of the coveted paper coupon, each soldier also had to pay from his own pocket from 2 to 10 marks, depending on the class of the establishment and the specific situation at hand. Thus, it turned out that one girl could earn from 20 to 50, and even up to 100 marks in a day of such hard and exhausting work, accumulating very significant and substantial sums of money in a very short time. For comparison and to understand the scale, it can be said that at that time in Germany itself, the average monthly wage of a simple worker at a plant or factory was only 120 or 150 marks. This clearly demonstrates what huge money revolved in this specific sphere of the war economy.